What's happening in Sterile Processing Universe? It's Hank Balch here. Thank you for tuning in to Workers or Widgets, a symposium on sterile processing, robotics, and automation. And our guest for this session is Shawn Flynn. Shawn, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure with you, Hank.
So I know for folks who are familiar with the Beyond Clean brand, you're not going to be a strange name or face, but tell us what you're up to these days. I think the last time we talked, you were still managing the department out at Lucille Packard's Children's Hospital in sterile processing, and we talked about building an excellent sterile processing department. And something tells me that you're still kind of in that space, but maybe in a different part of it. So yeah, fill us in.
Yeah, so I, of course, was at Lucille Packard. It's a Children's Hospital of Stanford, and I was there almost for 2 years. And my main responsibility was really building that department up. They went from a 5,000 square foot footprint to just over 12,000, and if you add the mini SPD, that's another, probably another 5,000 square foot. So we had to build the team up, bring in new equipment. Really train them on a new workflow because they weren't necessarily used to that coming from that smaller footprint. And so in the process of doing that, I actually got connected with Stanford Research Institute, which is separate from Stanford. I think in the 40s, they separated from Stanford, but now it's called Stanford or SRI International. And for those who aren't familiar with them, they do some cutting edge technology there. In the sense of probably everybody's familiar with the computer mouse. The mouse was created there. Siri actually was created there as well and licensed to Apple.
I didn't know that.
The Da Vinci robot that, in particular, we're talking about surgery and sterile processing, that was born out of SRI. And so I started talking to them about doing something in the sterile processing space. And ironically, they had already wanted to do something in this space, but just really didn't know the subtle nuances of it. And so I started meeting with them to try to brainstorm on some new ideas about, our particular space. And one of the, the cool things that came out of that was enhanced inspection, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and looking at that footprint to say, okay, if you think about it like this, a technician can look at about 1,000 instruments per shift, right? There's eye fatigue, there's a lot of distractions in sterile processing. And so what we wanted to do was create an augmented tool to help technicians actually perform their tasks better related to the inspection component to it. And also the identification and, subtle characteristics or flaws in the devices that would render them either to be repaired or to be replaced. And so we went down that pathway, and lo and behold, we formed a company called Bedrock Surgical around that, where we're using a lot of computer vision, AI, enhanced inspection using some novel new sensing technology that is not currently on the marketplace, that we actually de-risked and developed at SRI. And so now we're in the fundraising phase of the business. And so that's what I've been focused on thus far. So
that's awesome, John. And I know that fundraising piece, you've been through the startup world, so many times in your career that I'm sure that's kind of the name of the game for you. But that's such a hard time in the life of a startup and of an idea, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, or it's the determining factor if the rubber is even going to meet the road at all. So I appreciate you taking time out of that to join us and have this educational conversation. And I know I told you off air before we got started today, but one of the reasons that I'm very excited to talk to you is you bridge an interesting gap in this automation, robotic, AI, machine learning, machine vision space, because you're not only interested in that technology, promoting the technology, creating the technology, but you've also been a user, like from the technician level all the way up to managing these departments. And that's such a rare combination of insight and perspective, plus the vision and the access, to the engineers or to the creators of the technology itself. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this conversation, how does that impact what you bring to the table in changing the industry? Like, has that helped you? Have you felt like it's maybe held you back in a conversation because everybody else out here is a bunch of engineers, like PhDs? Like, where do you kind of sit it?
Yeah, I think from experience standpoint, me going into different areas that relate to sterile processing have helped tremendously because I know where the dots are connected, and when you're conveying information or let's say, criteria for building something, you kind of need to know the ecosystem. And so when meeting with the engineers, particularly at SRI, having that in-depth knowledge about sterile processing, its workflow, the staffing component, the infrastructure, the hospital layout as far as hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers, and then how they interact with purchasing and the instruments themselves, gives them a better mosaic to be able to create something that is actually usable on the front line. And where I see innovation going wrong is when you don't have enough feedback and somebody actually creates something and the user actually doesn't interact with it in a way that uses all the components that they've built. So for example, tracking systems.
That's where I thought you were going.
Tracking systems on the market. I mean, most of individuals, they use barely, maybe 5-10% of its capabilities. And really it's related to not really understanding that workflow and what that technician has to go through. Let's say for decontam, for example, right? I've always been fascinated why we don't have touch screens in decon and why we are so dependent on keyboards and mouses when we all have technology outside of sterile processing that is more user-friendly, has a better interface. But to answer your question, you have to have that in-depth knowledge to be able to convey that to the engineers and individuals who are creating the hardware and software so that it works more effectively in the field.
So I know I promised we were going to get to the meat of the interview, but I got another follow-up now on that. There's likely going to be folks listening to this interview, or perhaps like other parts of the symposium too, and they get interested in this, and they're like, I really like what Shawn's doing. I would love to position myself to be at the front of an innovation like this. Like, you kind of describe the context, for how you got introduced, to the SRI team and the opportunities around that, but if you were like mentoring or coaching a sterile processing leader, technician out there to prepare themselves to get the opportunities that you got to get into this automated, like robotic space, what would you tell those folks?
I would tell them initially, don't be closed-minded in the sense that you can't do something, right? Or that environment is foreign to you, so therefore you won't take the risk to learn that environment. I mean, I could have easily been intimidated by, literally sitting at a boardroom table and having 8 to 10 PhDs working at SRI, and I could have, not even done that out of fear, right? But when you get into those situations, what you have to realize is that you are the expert in what you do. They're the expert in what they're doing. What you're doing is what we call in the entrepreneur space cross-pollination. So I'm actually giving them feedback, and then they're giving me feedback on their capabilities of what they can do. And through that process, you actually are innovating, or you can innovate out of that. And so first thing I would say, just don't be fearful to go into those environments and ask a bunch of questions and just be curious. And that's, I've done that throughout my whole career, and no matter what I've done. So when I went into manufacturing, I had never, gotten a medical device cleared through the FDA, but you put good people around you, you ask the right questions, you learn the process. And at the end of the day, that now you have additional knowledge that you didn't possess. And it's always because you weren't fearful to try it.
Right. I mean, when you're describing that scenario of like all the PhDs around the table, it reminded me of a lot of experiences kind of in the OR, where if you're new to sterile processing or new to leadership, you can be intimidated by these surgeons. They're walking around with MD on their tags, and you're like, oh yeah, how can how can I have like a peer-to-peer conversation with these guys and gals and actually say, hey, we need to change your practice or we need to update this, but then you finally get to that point in your career with a confidence level to say, hey, they're great at what they do, but they don't have any idea what we do. And it is that cross-pollination opportunity to teach them and to show that you are an expert in what you know. And if you're not yet, become an expert and then leverage that expertise, to drive those relationships. So yeah, I think that's a great example and a great insight there. So let's talk about the transition toward automation. And in particular, I kind of want to ask you, what in your opinion is driving the growing number of companies and innovators getting into this automated robotic space in sterile processing?
I think the short answer to that is I think the pandemic actually was a catalyst for what we all talk about as the Great Resignation, and so you had a lot of people leave their industries in droves, and what's left is a labor shortage. And we see it in the sterile processing space and even in the nursing, nursing space, right? Where, technicians and nurses and surgical techs are going towards more, agency type work and not actually being at the hospital as a hospital employee. And I see that as the first phase of, maybe a Band-Aid approach to it. Because we literally have a labor shortage and not enough people are going into this industry to keep pace with a lot of the surgical volume and the instrumentation that needs to be processed and inspected correctly. And so, at least for our space, what's driving that is those two components. But then when you look at automation and robotics, we see it in other areas, other industries, right? So, food services, we're seeing in autonomous vehicles, we're seeing it in manufacturing, right? And to a certain degree, sterile processing is no different than really manufacturing. The only difference is you're actually taking already manufactured widgets and then re-inspecting them for continued use. Whereas in the manufacturing setting, you're building something new, doing final inspection and shipping that out, and it never returns. So in some cases, sterile processing actually, at least the policies and procedures and the attention to detail it needs to be more heightened, I think, in a traditional manufacturing setting, because it's not a new widget that you're inspecting, it's a used widget. And every time it's used, there's a certain degradation to that instrument. There's a certain amount of, rust or residual detergent that could be left on it. So, multiple factors, but I think what's really driving it is, one, the pandemic exacerbated, and then there's truly a labor shortage, and the pandemic just ripped the Band-Aid off.
Right. Yeah. It is interesting to think about if we would have had this conversation 3 years ago, the inputs would have been different. The application would have been the same because nothing really changed about the process, but that context of making an argument for, hey, there is a need to automate, there's a need to find greater efficiency. Like I think everyone probably would have agreed 3 years ago, but now there's no denying that there is a labor shortage. It's getting worse, and there is no end in sight. It's not like there's going to be an easy fix of a whole bunch of new qualified technicians flooding the market in 2 years. That's going to fix the problem, not only in sterile processing, but all of healthcare.
Yep.
So let's talk about concerns around automation. You alluded kind of tangentially to one of them around the staffing piece, but we can go in a little more in depth here. But anytime this conversation comes up in the sterile processing world, if there's like a video of a robot that goes out there, or anybody says anything about automation, it raises a lot of heckling from the masses. And again, go back to what we said earlier. You and I have been in the shoes of the technicians themselves and of the department leaders. What are some of those concerns that you hear in these conversations, and how do you kind of respond to or give context to those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing that comes up typically is that, oh, a robot will never replace a human being. And I hear that, a ton, particularly, and I'll use this one example. There's a robot that we've probably all seen on social media that is wrapping surgical trays, right? Now the genie is out the bottle at this point, and what was shown on that video was actually at a half speed for demo purposes. The other thing is, as the technology gets better and as the programming gets better, the workflows change. You're going to see more and more automation enter into this space. The robot that wraps trays is just an example of one element to it. But if you look at that entire workflow and reimagine what that workflow could look like with automation alongside the technicians, then you have a brand new sterile processing department. And I think the other concern that I would have in inputting robots into the current infrastructure is, there are some dangers when you're working with robots side by side with human beings. They move based on how they're programmed. Well, in a workflow environment where you have other human beings, we have the autonomy to move independently of, even our programming, or, where we have, we can adapt to that environment where. So I would look at it from a standpoint of, if you're going to put robots into the environment, you have to really reimagine that workflow, so that then the technicians aren't, being harmed by the robots, either bumping into them or, what have you. And then there also needs to be some staging that occurs, because, you can't have an OR send you a jumbled up basket of instruments and then expect a robot to actually go through that jumbled up basket of instruments. If a human being doesn't like doing that, you can rest assured a robot isn't going to, do that effectively, right?
All right.
So those are the concerns. And again, from a technician standpoint, I kind of look at it as opportunity. So we already experienced a staffing shortage in the space. Well, what better way to elevate a technician's skill set than to train them on running an actual automated and roboticized sterile processing department with certain quality controls augmented by software, so that now that technician is not just pushing widgets, they're actually running a highly sophisticated sterile processing department that, for all intents and purposes, is going to require new skills, right? New training. And so I see this as a new opportunity. And, part of the reason why I'm an entrepreneur is because I look at the world in that way.
Right.
But I think technicians, they're kind of too close to the problem to really see, what's on the horizon and what's coming. It's kind of like, we're on the, I like sci-fi. So, and when every perspective is everything. So when you're on the surface of the earth, you have that perspective. But when you go in outer orbit, now you see the whole globe and the perspective changes. So, I don't blame the technicians who are saying that there is, that they have fearful about robots and automation coming to the space. But at the same time, I would encourage them to actually, go out and embrace it, because it's an opportunity for new certifications. It's an opportunity for new education, new training, increases in salary, because now you're doing something that, requires a different skill set, right? So I think all those things go in hand in hand. But the biggest thing that I see is just fear from technicians. And then that segues me into, then what is the responsibility of the companies who are bringing this automation, right? As Bedrock Surgical, I think we have a responsibility to transition those technicians into that space as we bring in more automation into that environment. Now, not all companies are going to have that philosophy, but we feel like, that's our responsibility. And if we're going to do that and enhance the space by bringing automation and robotics, then we're going to bring our technicians along with us for that transition.
I go back to something that you said about how innovators view the world, and that's such an important part of this conversation. I think in some of the promotional content around this event, I use the word philosophy of technology or philosophy of automation, and that's really getting at how you look at problems in front of you or in your industry, and it's a difference between people. It's a difference, sometimes even um, between kind of backgrounds. Like my wife and I view the world completely different. Like when something bad or challenging is happening out in the world, like she tends to kind of get stressed a little bit.
Hmm.
And then I look at it as, oh, well, if something bad's happening, then that means there's an opportunity out there. Like even like the supply chain crisis. I was talking to my dad about this last weekend, and yeah, like there's all these like ships off the coast. They can't get them off. And I told my dad, I said, yeah, like, there's no clear answer to it right now, but I can tell you there's a whole bunch of folks sitting around saying, I can make money off of solving this problem. And they're working their butts off to try
Hmm.
to find some solutions because that's just how innovators work, But in our industry, the challenge is like we don't want to turn everybody into us or
Yeah.
to have just one perspective on the world. Like it's okay to view the world differently, uh, but and that goes into your second piece. How do we at least communicate all of the concerns and the context for those concerns in a way that everybody at least understands what they're concerned about or stressed about, and they're not being
Hmm.
concerned or stressed about something that's not true or that's not the goal or that's not going to happen. And your example of um, the robotic engineer, the collaborative
Hmm.
approach, for technology and for technicians to actually work with these devices
Yep.
and not necessarily just be replaced by them. And I don't know why I've never thought about this before, but as you were describing that, I started thinking about the Da Vinci robot.
Hmm.
Um, that's not replacing surgeons.
No.
But what Da Vinci is out there like taking the job of that robotic surgeon. It's being driven by the surgeons,
Hmm.
and it's impacting the workflow and everything else, but to date, it's not replaced anything. Now, no, that is a
Yeah.
different technology and application, but yeah, there's a lot of uh, potential there, I think, to your point, to look on the bright side. And then your other point is if it's coming, it's a lot better to be prepared and to be that proactive person out there getting the certification, getting the education, and saying, how can I
Hmm.
pivot now instead of wait another 5 or 10 years and then have it, kind of sweep me to the side.
Yeah. I mean, you see this in I'm reading this book called Scary Smart, right? And it's about AI and how its advances will soon outpace our ability, our cognitive ability, and when it comes to computational analysis and things like that, right? Now, that might scare a lot of people in the sense that, okay, robots will have that capability or computers will have that capability. However, in the book, they illustrate that that's an opportunity for us to actually go back to the things of what makes us human beings, and that is interacting with other human beings, philosophy, the things that a computer necessarily can't do that we're gifted in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you look at the ecosystem now, a lot of our tasks are done by human beings, from which if you replace that task with a robot and then refocus that human being's potential in other aspects, because that time is now freed up, then you have a different society, you have a different system, right? How better our society would be if we went back to actually communicating one directly with each other versus utilizing devices and not communicating.
Actually, talk to people, Shawn. What are
Yeah.
you crazy?
Exactly. So and it's I'm reading it to understand more fully about AI and its capabilities. And one thing that they talk about in there is getting to a point where um, uh, AI actually surpasses human capabilities, right? In analyzing certain things. Now, when you're talking about supply chain and logistics, right? Um, you look at the capability, and I'm gonna segue a little bit. So you look at Tesla, right? If you ever looked at the screenshot of a Tesla and it's computing, certain barriers are going down the road, it looks at certain markers, it looks at the red light, it looks at other cars, and all these things are moving in real time. Well, it takes a certain computational capacity to be able to do that, and it's just going to get better and better. And people are fearful of autonomous roving vehicles, but that day is already here, right? So as we get better at it, I think you'll see more and more of that. And if you take AI and then put the lens on healthcare, logistics, and supply chain for that matter, then you get a whole nother picture of what we can't currently see, right? Because the computers are running computational or analysis at a rate that even a group of people couldn't do, right?
Right.
So healthcare is going to change, and it's going to change considerably, but I think it'll change considerably for the better because of that, right? And then human beings can get back to actually providing care, right? And not doing these, mundane tasks. One of the things we're looking at from a software perspective is embedding our software to do a lot of the work on the back end so that the user actually is, intuitively using the system, but not having to do all the mundane tasks like data entry, right? Because data entry technicians then make mistakes naturally as human beings, but that then makes the data bad, right? And so you're only as good as your
Right.
data. So those are the things that we're thinking about internally, to make that experience for the user much more pleasurable, and then that then transfers into them using the system to its fullest, right?
I go back to something that you said around um, how it's the mundane task, that we really is that low hanging fruit that hopefully everybody can agree. Like, who wants to do something that can be done more easily by a machine or a computer?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and going back to something that I kind of alluded to with the philosophy piece, like just the dignity of our workers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if we can better use their skill set and their natural human abilities, to your point, to do critical thinking, to do communication in a way that can understand nuance and emotion and all the things that are critical for healthcare. It is a
Yeah.
production environment, but it's a production environment that involves a lot of people and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of humanness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really getting at closer to what the heart is for that collaborative vision of a philosophical approach to automation. And I know I asked this question, but maybe it's potentially asking too much of our innovators to also be philosophers at the same time. It's not asking too much for there to be a coherent philosophy around automation
Mm-hmm.
out there in the ecosystem. And to my knowledge, I know it is out there broadly because like automation is 10, 20 years or even longer. Like it's been out there in the space. But for sterile processing, I think we've got some work to do as clinicians to give feedback and provide some of those guardrails and boundaries out
Mm-hmm.
there that we expect from these companies that are coming in to automate
Mm-hmm.
the space and to improve the space.
Well, you bring up a good point in that. And, if you look at social media, right? Social media has a bad rap right now. And it's related to the algorithms that actually try to bend and massage human behavior. And all AI is as good as those algorithms that are put into that system. Okay. And so from a responsibility standpoint, we do have a responsibility to make sure that there's a diverse group of individuals who are creating those algorithms, because that then represents a more broader picture of what humanity looks like, and
Right.
and that and
Because
that
it's
system.
people, because
Yeah.
people making them and they're being impacted on people. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, from a philosophy standpoint, I think as a company and leading the company, I think we do have a responsibility to make sure we do have proper feedback, to make sure that, once we do launch into this sterile processing environment with whatever automation and robotic tools that we create, that it's done in a way that works alongside the technicians. And again, when I was interacting with SRI, it's we talked a lot about augmented tools to help technicians, because the environment is such where um, we all run across those superstar technicians, but even they get burned out. And then the sheer volume of instrumentation that comes through a sterile processing department, we're not made to look at certain things in that rate of repetition with that amount of detail, right?
Right.
So in creating a a sensing platform that actually augments that technician's ability to see certain micro aspects of a device that might render it non-suitable for the OR. Well, again, I think that's a value add to it, and the technician interacts with the hardware and the software, and they work together. So, it's just one of those things where if you have that mindset and have that experience of working in that field, I think you can bring those ideas to the table when you're developing new innovative products.
So let's take that kind of in-house, like we've been talking about the innovator side of things, but from the perspective of the department leader, what role, if any, do they have in helping to navigate the impact of automation in their departments, on their processes, and on their people? Do you have any insight or opinion on that?
Yeah, I think just them being curious about, automation and robotics, looking at other industries, and how they've transitioned from a more, let's say, physical, human being dependent manufacturing setting to a more automated. I think it will be helpful because a lot of hospital or healthcare leaders are really looking at what's going to drive costs down and improve quality. And if those leaders in sterile processing are thinking with that lens, then they're in alignment with, the hospital executives who are also looking at that. I was just talking to a physician at Stanford yesterday, and our main conversation was talking about increased quality and reduced cost, right? At what point do they have a scorecard that tells them after a procedure that this is how much their case cost, right? Actual cost, right? They have no visibility to those things at this point in time. Where if you look at other industries, your cost of goods, right? And cost of goods sold, down to the penny. But in healthcare, it's all over the place. So we've got a lot of work to do. But I think to answer your question, I think you have to have that lens, similar lens that the healthcare executives have when you're trying to, increase quality and drive down costs. And that doesn't mean that you do it at the expense of the human capital that you have, right? You reinvest in them. And me, I'm a proponent of, going up to the C-suites and making the argument of how this impacts operationally surgery, which is 2/3 of the revenue of the hospital system, right? When you do that, I think you now have a seat at that table where they're making those decisions. Whereas if you don't, and you're not curious and you're not looking with that lens, you're not at that table. And so they're going to make decisions on your behalf that may or may not benefit you as a sterile processing department and or leader, right? Early on in my career, I got the opportunity to work directly with the vice president of operations for a large healthcare system. And I actually had visibility to the board at the board level. And so that gave me a lot of insights operationally about how the hospital works, what their concerns are, what other departments that they have to be concerned with, and how they all interact with each other. And so I was just curious about how that whole thing works. And I got the opportunity to see it in real time. And it just gave me a whole total new mindset about, hospital operations, the business side of it, what supply chain has to go through. And, so I just say, be curious and start looking at the lens from a business perspective on how that department impacts the rest of operations, particularly surgery. But
it really goes back, I think, to what we were talking about before at kind of a higher level. But if automation is coming, and we know it as department leaders, we owe it to our team to be prepping them now with the information that's out there, with the technology that's out there, to try to be ahead of the curve again, so that we're not kind of sideswiped or I've been kind of thinking as you were talking about the rollout of the electronic health records, electronic medical records, and how a lot of those decisions were not made by the clinicians or the physicians who would be using that program. And we see just the tremendous, pushback and frustration because that was not prepped or communicated up and down from the decision makers and the users, and everybody was not on the same page. It was kind of a top-down implementation, saying, "Hey guys, on this date, we're using this. Buckle up." And are we surprised that didn't work out too well for the users?
Well, if you look at the IFU situation, right? I mean, a lot of these IFUs are written not by sterile processing professionals, right? And their input isn't even included in that. It's in some cases is written as a legal document to get through the FDA clearance process, right? And so that is an example of if you had individuals who were actually giving input, even something as simple as layout, the actual size of the font, a consistent layout where you go from one manufacturer to another and the layout's the same and standardized. Those things go a long way when you're talking about IFU compliance. But, just like, we have an opportunity with robotics, we still have an opportunity to be involved in, the creation of these IFUs and lobbying certain manufacturing companies to be included in that. And, so again, nothing is perfect when it initially launches. So I look at that as well. But know that the innovation actually gets better over time, right? Same with the robotics and automation, that robot that actually wraps surgical trays, it's going to get better over time. And then imagine a department where you have 4 of those units, they're going to run 24/7. They're not going to need vacation days, right? And so your production still continues, but you're also going to need technicians to actually understand, the workflow and what's needed, right?
Right.
So, there's benefits to it, but it's going to scare some people. And, with our company, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that those technicians who are with us in the early days are transitioned into that new automated and robotic environment.
So Shawn, I want to start wrapping up on this question. We'll see if it's just one question or if we end up with some other rabbit trails here. But
okay,
you've alluded a couple of times to some of the misconceptions, and I think in the book that you mentioned, Scary Smart, that there's some misunderstanding around what AI is currently capable of, what robotics and automation are currently capable of. And then if you could kind of bring that down to application and sterile processing, we kicked off this interview with you making the comment that the number one concern is the number one concern from frontline users is that a robot's never going to replace a sterile processing technician. So can you break down some of those misunderstandings, or maybe just give us some insight, from an insider in that industry? What are we missing as the average technician that's going on behind the scenes with this tech?
Wow. It's moving at light speed. There are a number of firms that I know of who are working on the robotics piece, including some of the AI components. And when you look at just the logistics and supply chain piece, you go into a hospital environment and you look at the instrumentation, the diversity of instruments that are in that space, right? And then you layer on top of that the manufacturers, then you layer on top of that the pricing, then you layer on top of that the distributors, then you layer on top of that all the hospitals and the surgeries that are performed and the instruments that are used are tied to those surgeries, right? I can go on and on about that, but once you get to a certain level, it's like hard to visualize or see where the opportunity is, because there's so much data. And so for me, my understanding of AI and what it's capable of is really looking at all of those things and making certain assumptions and insights that us as human beings can't currently see, right? Because the environment is really complicated. If you look at MRIs, right? We have already AI applications who interpret an MRI. Now you still need a human being to do it, but there are applications that are doing that, and they do it at a higher degree of success rate than an actual human being. So, I just use that as an example. But instruments, for example, we all know the complexities of them. I know no tech who knows every surgical instrument that is out there, that is tied to which surgical procedure it's used on, and then particularly in the sequence of what instruments are used during that procedure, right? AI has that capabilities of knowing those things. And then imagine the insights that you would get out of that, right? You can do, asset sharing more effectively, right, amongst your facilities. So your actual cost of acquiring those instrumentation goes down, because now you are scheduling based on your inventory and moving inventory seamlessly through those particular cases, and you don't need an instrument set for this particular hospital for this day, as well as the other hospital who's doing it on a different day, right? So there's a lot of insights that I think you can glean from that. There's other things like shelf life, for example. Ask a technician and say, well, give me the shelf life of this particular instrument. They wouldn't know that other than when it gets damaged, right? But when you're trying to plan for obsolescence of that particular instrument, and you know the quality defects of that instrument over a period of time or usage, you can pretty much predict when that instrument's going to fail and when you need a replacement, right? That's some of the things that we're doing internal to Bedrock Surgical, and AI is a big component of that, right? And having worked with a lot of the PhDs over at SRI, and I've learned a tremendous amount of its capabilities, and I said, well, can it do this? Can it do that? And they're like, well, yeah, and it's not futuristic science, sci-fi type stuff. This is here, and it's going to be really interesting in our space. And I'm just, I'm glad I'm on the frontier of it, but I'm just eager to see what everybody else is doing at the same time, because at the end of the day, we're all going to try to reshape healthcare and then make it better for the actual, human beings who need that type of care. We talked earlier about what it's capable of and how it will replace and put us in a position where we're actually talking one-on-one. Like if you ask a robot or an AI system, what is pain, or is that person in pain, right? They have no way of analyzing whether that person's in pain or not. And the person could answer your question, or they may not be able to answer that question. Well, a nurse who's giving that care over time will be able to intuitively know that, right? So there's some things that it won't be able to do or be able to measure. But it gets us back to doing that more humanistic side of healthcare, I think. But
yeah,
hopefully that answers your question.
It does. And to your comment about the impact on data in particular, and how there's just so much data, it's not necessarily that we don't have enough data in healthcare. It's that we're not doing anything with it, or we're not doing everything that we could with it, because it's either so overwhelming or so disorganized or so disjointed. It's in all these little data silos that don't talk to each other, and there's all kinds of work, even outside of AI, to break down those barriers. I know, but I'm really curious, even I guess how we started this interview to also close this interview, in that we look at some of these automated processes in our departments, and we kind of forget, that there was a day that there was no such thing as an automated washer, for instance. And I don't know anybody on the planet. It's like, I want to go back to those days when we didn't have an automated wash, and I want to hand wash every single device that comes through this department. And, likewise, there's a lot of other things that have been automated in healthcare in general, and sterile processing in particular, that we love. And we've come to just assume is kind of the furniture in the department. But what you're telling us today is there's some new furniture coming, and it's going to be good, not bad.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to some, and it may be scary for others because they don't understand it. But I think over time, it'll put us in a much better position as sterile processing departments who provide a service for the OR and those patients. Again, there are just certain things that we don't do well. And unfortunately, inspection, when it's layered on top of time constraints, we don't do that very well, right? And imagine being in a environment, and I tell, individuals on the team, I say, we work in a current system where you're not rewarded for finding things necessarily, right?
Right.
We work in an environment where if you find something, it's like, okay, yeah, push that aside. Or we work in an environment where 98% of the things are done well, but they only focus on the 2%, the things that went wrong, right?
Right.
So internal to our organizations, we're trying to flip that paradigm where we actually are seeking those things out that would directly impact the patient in a bad way, so that we incentivize technicians to look for things, so that we don't have instruments that go to surgery that are defective, or they have bioburden, or rust or whatever, right?
Right.
And having a system that actually gives the technicians, or empowers the technicians to find those things, so that we can, and this is what we're going to do. I haven't talked about this much, but imagine having a guarantee on every instrument that goes to surgery that it's defective free, right? Defect free. It has no residual soil, right? And it functions properly. Like, nobody can issue that guarantee currently. Right.
Right.
I
That's
don't
the
know
goal.
anybody doing it. Yeah.
That's the goal, but yeah, no guarantees.
So I think with the technology that we've created, we'll be able to issue that guarantee. And I look forward to the day when, I go into a sterile processing department where our technicians are actually incentivized for finding things and then fixing that issue before it goes to surgery. Right. And it's all based on, that technology, the human capital, and us being able to provide that guarantee. But technology enables that, Hank. And we're in a weird space where not a lot of innovation has come through, the sterile processing environment. But I think we're at that point where, if you're really going to optimize perioperative services or surgery in general, particularly when you're talking about a lot of cases now migrating to the ambulatory surgery center space, you have to invest in sterile processing and reimagine it, for that matter. So I just tell the technicians out there, embrace new technology, be curious, go seek it out, because it is coming. And then if you seek it out, what you'll end up finding is that there are opportunities out there in other lanes that you might be able to move into as a result. And you take that sterile processing experience and then layer on top of that new experiences. At the end of the day, you'll have a more diverse skill set that is going to be needed in the coming future.
All right, Shawn, I love that good word and encouragement toward the end. For anybody who's still like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. There's hope, and you heard it first here from Shawn Flynn. For folks who want to get in contact with you, Shawn, and continue the conversation, maybe, how can they reach out?
Yeah, they can send me an email at sflynn, FLYNN, at bedrocksurgical.com.
Okay, beautiful. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this session of Workers or Widgets, a symposium on sterile processing, robotics, and automation. There's going to be a couple more sessions coming out, so please stay tuned. And as always, keep fighting dirty. And as you heard on this session, buckle up, because fighting dirty is going to get a little bit more automated and robotic in the coming days. Be prepared and try to find the upside and the opportunity in all these changes that are coming down the pipeline. Thanks again, folks, and we'll